Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is March 6, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It is an honor to be joined in dialogue by members of the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. Today we start our reading of the Sophist, ending at 235b. In ancient Greece, a sophist was a teacher who exchanged his professed expertise for money, and in Plato's dialogue, the extent of the sophist's expertise is called into question. We will see the application of Plato's method to identify the imitation and contradictions in the sophist's teaching, and we will have a chance to consider the many ways that sophistry is practiced today. As always, I've suggested 3 themes to focus our discussion, which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. As participants exchange their thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. To contribute your thoughts, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. Using first name from your screen profile, I'll call on you to speak in the order that hands are raised, giving precedence to those who haven't spoken before. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome any participants who wish to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So the majority of the dialogue in the first part of the Sophist takes place between young Theaetetus and an unnamed visitor from Elea. The visitor is a follower of Parmenides, and Parmenides' maxim that the form of being, of that which is unopposed. For Parmenides and the visitor, the words "that which is not" are an illogical contradiction and cannot be. We'll explore more of the form of being in our next episode, preparing for that today in our focus on Plato's method of collection and division. Using this method, expertise is divided into successive opposites to follow the common thread and, quote, chase a thing through both the particular and the general, unquote, in order to give a clear account of what the sophist is, by means of dialectic. The visitor from Elea asserts the necessity of this method to reach an agreement about the thing itself by means of a verbal explanation rather than doing without any such explanation and merely agreeing about the name. At issue is the name that we apply to anything like expertise. Just because someone takes the name of expert doesn't mean that they are in fact knowledgeable. Although sophist translates as pursuer of wisdom, he is presented as an imitator who professes a wide range of knowledge but lacks understanding of the truth of a thing. The sophist will tell us what a thing is not, but cannot say what a thing is, particularly virtue, knowledge of which the sophist claims to hold and sells to unsuspecting youth. So what does a sophist know about virtue? How does the sophist learn about virtue? And is virtue even teachable? That was the question in Plato's Meno, and of obvious importance to the shaping of young minds. Does the sophist know his own limitations? So the worst type of ignorance, says the visitor from Elea, is not knowing, but thinking that you know. He goes on to state, that's what probably causes all of the mistakes we make when we think. Before we begin to examine Plato's method of collection and division, I thought it would be helpful for context to discuss examples of modern sophistry. How do we understand the meaning of the name expert, which seems to appear with increasing frequency in news reports? And how do we discern truth from fiction in what the so-called experts say? Does technology help us to determine the value of expertise on sale, or does it exploit ignorance? Do any types of modern sophistry come to mind? So I just wanted to put that question out there for anyone to comment on. Do we see examples of this, selling of expertise today? And, that question about technology, how does our use of technology now kind of affect that transaction that we make in the exchange of knowledge? Does it help? Does it hinder? Does it do both? Because we don't use the word sophist now. It's a word that doesn't really appear at all very often. It's a word that certainly I think was a lot more common back in ancient Greece. But just wanted to get some thoughts on that. Moshe, your thoughts?
Yes, we don't use sophist like we used to. Technology, to address your question specifically, I think enables us to be both lazy and engaged simultaneously, not to the same people. It makes people lazy because you can read something somewhere, and like Deirdre said, that once something is in print, it becomes like a canon. It becomes like an axiom, a law. And so you see something on a social platform or one of the many disinformation websites out there, and then of course, well, that's the correct analysis. That's the I don't want to say the word truth, but it's something similar to that. It's something that a person makes a claim to knowledge about. On the other hand, technology makes it such that we can do a lot of research behind behind any story or claim. We can go to multiple sources and find out what other people are saying, and interrogate sources, interrogate witnesses ourselves, and come up with something that is not blended with some political message. And all we have to do is take the time to go out and do the research. So, I think technology can be sort of can be a double-edged sword there for people who want to find out what's really going on. It's a tremendous tool, and for those people who simply want to be, for lack of a better term, sucked into the contemporary zeitgeist, you can be completely lazy with it.
I think a lot of people would agree with that take on it, Moshe, that it's kind of a double-edged sword. I'm not sure if you use that term, but it's it has its advantages and its disadvantages. Certainly very different, I guess, from the days of ancient Greece, where ideas would be transmitted in writing or verbally, and now we've got this other means of communication. So thank you for that. And JK, your take on that?
So a sophist, the way Plato describes the sophist, it's a person who he claims to know everything. He's an expert on everything, and no matter what area of knowledge, but they're really really expert in disputation, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, if you want an answer, you go to a sophist. They'll give you. They'll tell you. They'll teach you how to gain knowledge of whatever you want to know, or skill or knowledge, whatever you want to learn. But it's really the person with all the answers. And so today we could, we look to people who will give us the answer, like motivational speakers or whatever, kind of new age, fad or whatever that comes along. You can subscribe to them, pay them money, and they'll teach you how to live your life and improve your life. Mm-hmm. So with technology, it also provides a kind of an easy answer, right? They'll just, you purchase the right technology, you can use it as an instrument, but maybe it's also the illusion that you can just depend on technology to do everything for you. Mm-hmm. Is that a kind of an imitation of what the sophist is talking about? They're also imitators, right? They're able to represent something that replaces what the truth is, or what the truth is, what the reality is.
I think so. This idea that the sophist is an expert on everything, and that's referred to by the Visitor Familia, and you use the word dispute. The sophist, Plato writes, is good at dispute, which is he characterizes dispute as between private people, in private discussion, and controversy is the other type of skill that the sophist seems to have. And controversy he uses in the context of public discussion. So dispute is private and controversy is public, and the sophist seems to excel at both of those skills. And it's something that I think we see a lot of now. And it's as you said, I think it's held out to be some sort of imitation, and certainly the word imitation is used a lot in this. So, Jose, your thoughts?
Yes, something that Moshe had said that got me thinking about a question I once got from my daughter that said, "How do I know what's the truth these days? I mean, what do I read? How can I evaluate this thing?" And this is a discussion we had with my other colleague, Jose, and it was his idea that makes sense when you're dealing with thinking critically about a topic you don't know much about. Like, one thing is to discuss the weather or the politics, you read them in a newspaper. Another one is when you're talking about a subject that you don't know much about, and somebody makes a pronouncement or a claim about it. So some says, well, apply critical thinking. Yeah, but this is a subject I don't know much about. So an idea is you, instead of going and researching, I cannot research years of geometry or engineering to try to assess somebody's opinion on the subject. So what you do is you go to another qualified source, at least on paper, that has an opposed opinion to the other guy. Then what you do is you synthesize the arguments of both, and then you make your own decision about what to believe. You may be wrong, but at least it's your decision, which you couldn't make if you just listen to one expert, one so-called expert. In other words, it's a method to try to ascertain by yourself, without being yourself an expert in an area, just juxtaposition of two experts with credentials, analyze their arguments, and all you need to know how to do is how to evaluate an argument, and then decide, I think this is better than that. And then if you come across another one, you continue the synthesis of these two opposed opinions. Anyway, just a little, it may not work, so I haven't tried it yet. So don't blame me, blame the other Jose with this thing.
That's a really interesting idea. I like that idea of synthesizing opposed views. And obviously, one of the key themes here today is this idea of naming. And so if somebody takes the name expert, or the name expert is applied to somebody, and we see that a lot, so many times I look at a news headline and it says experts say. So just because somebody's being labeled an expert or labels themselves an expert doesn't mean that they're actually an expert. They could just be an expert in name only. But what you said about looking for opposed ideas and then synthesizing, I think that touches really kind of closely on what we're going to talk about today, this idea of this continual division that the visitor from Elia presents as a way of determining what somebody actually is, apart from the name that's applied to them, so that we can actually sift through this sort of imitation and find the truth of something. So I think that's a really interesting way of presenting it, that idea of looking for opposed views and finding some sort of common thread between them. Definitely a really interesting idea. Let's look at the excerpt from the text here. I'm just going to share my screen. And this is the notion of ideas being presented in a marketplace that appears around 219. So this particular short bit is from 219a to 219d. And here the visitor from Elia is talking about the nature of expertise and dividing expertise into types. So he starts by saying, expertise as a whole falls pretty much into two types. Theotitus, who he's talking to, is the young man. Theotitus says, how? And the visitor says, well, there's farming, or any sort of caring for any mortal body. And there's also caring for things that are put together or fabricated, which we call equipment. And there's imitation. The right thing would be to call all those things by a single name. Theotitus says, how? What name? The visitor says, when you bring anything into being that wasn't in being before, we say you're a producer, and that the thing you've brought into being is produced. Next, consider the whole type that has to do with learning, recognition, commerce, combat, and hunting. None of these creates anything. They take things that are or have come into being, and they take possession of some of them with words and actions, and they keep other things from being taken possession of. For that reason, it would be appropriate to call all the parts of this type acquisition. Aren't there two types of expertise in acquisition? Is one type mutually willing exchange through gifts and wages and purchase? And would the other type, which brings things into one's possession by actions and words, be expertise in taking possession? So this is the beginning of this process or method of dividing things into two. So he starts by talking about expertise. He says two types of expertise. There's caring for living things and caring for fabricated things. And fabricated things here includes learning. So these are things that are not brought into being. These are things that are applied to things that are already in being. So the production is bringing new things into being, and caring for things that are put together or fabricated. That's after something is being brought into being. So that's the two types of expertise that he says. So let's start, if we're going to say that somebody has expertise, let's start by dividing expertise into the various types. And then he, goes on to say, well, there's producers and there's acquirers. So the producer is somebody who brings things into being, and the acquirer is the person who, obtains that production. And obtains it in one of two ways. Obtains it by a willing exchange, which is through sale, in exchange for money, or in exchange for words and actions. And this is where we're starting to go down the line that eventually takes us to the sophist. So the sophist is one who applies words and actions to take possession of things, or to keep other things from being taken possession of. And so he's divided into production and acquisition. So it seems to me that it's like, presenting this context as a bit of a marketplace. There's buyers and sellers, and the sophist is doing the acquisition part of this. And it's the method of continual division. And what I did here was, if you can see this screen now with this breakdown of expertise. So this is kind of what I took from this section, from about 219 through 223 or so. I drew it as as each thing has two parts. And so I drew an arrow. So I started with the word expertise, which is what they're trying to find out. And I drew an arrow to one side saying caring for living things, or on the other side, the arrow goes to caring for fabricated things. So that's the split of expertise into two parts. So he leaves caring for living things aside, and then because he says that we're going to look at acquisition, so caring for the fabricated things then breaks down into two things: acquisition and production. So the arrows go two ways. And then from acquisition, there's two arrows, one going for willing exchange, or one taking possession with words and actions. And then from there, he goes on to talk about two types of taking possessions with word and actions. One is by open combat. The other is by secret hunting. And secret hunting, he says, you're looking either for lifeless targets or for living targets. Now, since we're dealing with sophists, the sophist is looking for living targets. And so he says, well, there's two types of living targets. One is aquatic, which interestingly, he puts both fish and birds in the aquatic category, which was an interesting thing I found. He doesn't really explore that too much, but it was an interesting little twist there. So he says, on one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you have living targets on land. And then he further divides the living targets on land between the wild things and the tame things. And so he takes this method and he just continually divides. So he's continually setting up opposites, and he's then following the line down, but it's always dividing into two. So I think this may reflect what he's said in Phaedo and Philebus and a whole bunch of other places, that things come to be in opposites. And so if we're continually comparing opposites, somewhere we find that common thread that follows through. And he's gone on to say, there was a paragraph at 221E to 222C about hunting for living things. The visitor says, we divided all hunting into two parts, one for land animals and one for swimming animals. We went through one part about the animals that swim underwater, but we left the land part undivided, though we noted that it contains many types. Up to that point, the sophist and the angler go the same way. So the angler, he's used as a simple example, non-controversial example. An angler is a hunter. And he's used the angler to give an example of how you divide the expertise of an angler in this way. So at this point, the angler and the sophist diverge. So the sophist is, he says, starting from animal hunting, though, they turn away from each other. One goes to ponds, rivers, and the sea and hunts for the animals there. That's the angler. The other one goes to the land and to different kinds of rivers, which are like plentiful meadows of wealthy youths, to take possession of the living things there. Theotetus says, what do you mean? Visitor says, there are two kinds of animals to hunt on land, tame things and wild ones. Theotetus says, is there any such thing as hunting tame animals? The visitor says, there is if human beings are tame animals at any rate. Make whichever assumption you like. Either there are no tame animals, or there are tame animals, but humans are wild, or else you'll say humans aren't hunted. Specify whichever you prefer to say. And Theotetus concludes, I think we're tame animals, and I'll say that humans are in fact hunted. And so then this process of continual division goes on. So this is the tame that are hunted by the sophist. And one way of hunting is by enslaving, or some form of tyranny that forces the person to submit to the sophist, and the others by persuasion with words and actions. And then there's that division between public and private. So the public, as I said, is where they use controversy, and the private is where they use dispute. So that's two different types of persuasion. And then that's further divided into persuasion for gifts, or persuasion for wages, persuasion for money. And then that's further divided into persuasion for pleasure, or persuasion on account of virtue. And that's where they wind up in the identification of the sophist, is that the sophist is someone who tries to persuade people to their particular view of virtue. And so I wonder what you think about this method of continual division, a way of identifying something, identifying that which we apply a name to. In this case, it's the name expertise, which is what the sophist claims to have. Does this particular method of division, this collection and division, I think is what it's formally called, does this seem logical to you? Does it seem to be a way that you actually think when you consider these things? Like when somebody says that they're an expert, would this way of dividing that term expert be helpful? Does it make logical sense, or is there any other way of dividing things? Moshe, JK, and then Jose.
Oh, good. Okay. I just want to mention the translation that I have at about 224b. The stranger is saying, the later should have two names, one descriptive of the sale of the knowledge of virtue, and the other the sale of other kinds of knowledge. So the sophist here is peddling knowledge. He's not peddling virtue. At least in my translation. The other thing is that this kind of I guess I'll call it dialectic, for lack of a better term, where you're bifurcating, you're constantly dividing between two different alternatives. practically locks the mind into a kind of paralysis where the interlocutor is being given these things at such a pace that they don't have time to think of an alternative. So my question is, for any of these particular things, going back and looking at it reflectively, is there a third option that should be put out there, or a fourth option that should be put out there? The last thing that I want to say is that I just get the feeling by listening to this, that the sophist is hiding, that the stranger is hiding his own sophistry. I'm sure he's hiding his own sophistry under this kind of analysis, because they start out at the beginning by talking about the sophist being, this reprehensible kind of guy or girl, and at the end they sell virtue. They sell knowledge to people who want to have knowledge and use it in a particular situation. So it is a classic example of what Plato calls sophistry, which is starting out with something, which is starting out and making the negative into a positive.
Interesting. And you asked, whether there is a third or fourth option, and I think that's well worth exploring. The part about virtue is around 223a, actually, where the visitor says, but doesn't the kind of wagering that actually earns money, though it claims to deal with people for the sake of virtue, deserve to be called by a different name? Theaetetus says, of course. The visitor says, what name? Try and tell me. Theaetetus says, it's obvious. I think we found the sophist. I think that's the name that would be suitable for him. And that's where they, really try to narrow it down to this, to the practice of selling that particular concept of virtue to the unsuspecting youths, those meadows of youths that he's talking about there. So yeah, a good question. Is there a third or a fourth way, or do we find this division by two to be adequate? We'll go to JK and Jose and then Darren.
So if this is a marketplace of ideas, or then that means that everybody involved in this marketplace, right, is a producer or consumer, right, of things, everybody's in it to both make a living and also to maybe at least participate in the pursuit of truth and understanding and knowledge. And so wouldn't that include Socrates as well? Everybody who's in the marketplace, even though Socrates is doing it for free, he's not charging, but he is also is also an expert on perhaps on virtue. So how at what point is he not a sophist, and the sophist is not a sophist, but also like Socrates,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they're both in the marketplace, and their actions are have some involved in some form of acquisition and production. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that question.
I think that's a great question. What differentiates Socrates from the sophist? And I'm wondering if it's at close to the beginning here at 217c, where Socrates says this to the stranger. So Socrates only appears at the very beginning of this dialogue. He appears actually with Theodorus, who's the geometer, and then they go off to the side, and then the rest of the dialogue is between the visitor and Theaetetus. But so Socrates at 217c asks the visitor, tell us this, when you want to explain something to somebody, do you usually prefer to explain it by yourself in a long speech, or do you do it with questions? That's the way Parmenides did it one time when he was very old and I was young. He used questions to generate a very fine discussion. And I'm wondering if that's part of the answer to the question that you raised. I mean, first of all, Socrates wasn't charging for distributing knowledge, but he was asking questions. And so he wasn't presenting his own opinion as much as sometimes he did kind of lead his interlocutors down a particular path, but he always gave them a chance to find their own way out. And we'll look at that method of teaching is one later on in this section that we're talking about today, where he says that this particular method of teaching, as opposed to giving your own opinion, this particular method of teaching allows the person you're talking to find the contradictions in their own logic. So I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a good question, and I wonder what other people think about that. We'll go to Jose and Darren, and then Jose J.
I don't have an answer to what you were proposing here, James, so I need to think it through. What I raised my hand about is I was captivated by this method of dividing. And let me tell you why. Do you remember when you were a kid? I think I mentioned this before, and you were doing the labyrinths. Right? At one point, you decide, I'm going to start from the end and find my way out, right? Instead of trying to enter through the periphery and trying to get to the middle of the labyrinth. So good for you. So then I think about this, and I will make sense of this point in a moment. Then you look at this division. The first thing you can tell is there are arbitrary divisions. I could divide expertise decide to divide it into I'm expert on the color red, and I'm not expert on anything that is not red. Every division is arbitrary. So then I thought, okay, what are these guys? These guys are in the persuasion business, not in the truth business. So if you want to persuade somebody of something, how will you do it? And I would exactly work backwards. And in fact, in sales, we've used that method before. You work backwards from the moment the client has signed the contract. And then you ask yourself, what happened a moment before that? Well, either the board approved it or the board did not approve it. That's one division. And you keep dividing. You keep dividing only in two. And then when you look at the chart in front of you, you decide, okay, what's the path to success? So if I were a sophist, I would be doing exactly this to persuade my interlocutor of what I'm trying to get to. So in other words, what I'm saying is this guy has already built this division, has concluded that this division leads him to success in persuasion. And now all he's doing is taking you through the labyrinth path. And when you get to the middle, you say, wow, you're awesome. Because he already prefabricated the path. Anyway, that's something that came to mind right away when I saw the method. I was more captivated by the method. Why that arbitrary division? Because it's arbitrary. Anyway, food for thought.
Yeah. No, and really interesting, the analogy to the labyrinth. And, it almost seems that, the visitor is talking about the labyrinth in our minds, the way that we go about, maybe, we've talked about the relativity of knowledge before, and maybe establishing two different poles to gauge, the relativity of one thing to another, is the way, Jose, that you said maybe that the sophist does things. But here, the visitor is saying this is how we hunt the sophist. So if the sophist is using this kind of method, then we can use that same method to hunt the sophist. But you raised a good question, and I thought about it too as I was reading this: are these divisions necessarily the only divisions that are possible? And that maybe goes back to Moshe's question too about, is there only two ways, or is there three ways or four ways that we can divide things? But is two maybe the most fundamental way that we can divide anything into two, and then from there we can further divide, but is two the most fundamental way that we can divide things? And so what if these are arbitrary? What does that do? Is there if you choose other arbitrary comparisons, would you still wind up at the same point if you're able to pick out all of the opposites? So it's a really good question, but I really like that labyrinth analogy. I think it really is helpful. So thank you for that.
What I was suggesting here, James, is that those divisions look arbitrary to me. They are not arbitrary to the person trying to persuade. He already walked the walk. Right.
Yeah. And the sales analogy that used, I think, is very important. Yeah. So if the seller is using an arbitrary method, then maybe the buyer needs to use the arbitrary method as well. So really, really interesting point. So thank you. So we'll go to Darren and then Jose, Jay, and then Moshe. So Darren, welcome to Plato's Pod.
Hi, thanks. So I have a ton of thoughts right now. So I'm just gonna address them by tackling James's most basic question that he posed at the start of this section, like what we think of this method, and is it logical? So I agree with what Jose just said, that well, first of all, I'll give a positive about it. Like, I think when you follow this method of division, as James's picture laid out here, you get a very clear picture of your options. And I think it helps you think more precisely. I mean, we get a really precise picture of one kind of sophist by the end of this process of division here, right? Like, you're able to say all these things about the sophist, although some of them seem pretty like trivial, like hunting like land versus sea creatures and stuff like that. So I think that's one thing that's positive about it. I think there is, like, someone raised the question of whether there are third options. I think that's a very serious issue. And I think this method of division makes most sense when you're saying something is or is not something. Like, that's very clear. Like, something either is something or is not something. Like, I think that's where this method actually would seem to work. But here, we're not doing that, right? We're actually saying like substantive things where we're trying to classify things into two categories. And often it's very unclear. It often seems arbitrary, like how he classifies things, like where to lump one thing or another, or even the division itself seems like very blurry. Like, how do we say, like, whether something is producing something or not? For instance, the idea of commerce doesn't really produce anything. Well, that's like, that's disputable, right? Like, some people will say, like, exchange, the process of exchange that, we call capitalism now, like, that does produce that sort of does produce things that you wouldn't have without the system otherwise. So anyway, we can go on disputing these things forever, right? Each of these distinctions. But I'm just saying, it does seem arbitrary how it's used here, but I think the method, it can be powerful, but maybe not in the way it's being used now. Like, and I think the dialogue eventually like turns to this question of being versus not being. It's interesting that it's not being used in this section. It's just saying whether one thing, is this thing, or is this other thing, rather than asking, is the thing this thing or not. I think it makes more sense to use this method. We're just saying, is this thing or not this thing? But so the method seems to be being applied a bit like wrong here in a way, but I think that might be deliberate on Plato's part. Maybe he's trying to. I haven't finished reading the dialogue. I only read the assigned reading and a few more pages after that. But so I'm thinking maybe something like this is coming up. So sorry, I'm going a long time here, but maybe I'll just make one more point then. I have so many thoughts, as I said. It's such a rich dialogue. I find Plato so rich, his dialogues. So this is addressing Jose's point about right, about the arbitrariness and how he mentioned that it's already set. So I agree as I said, I agree somewhat about the arbitrariness, at least it's being used in this section. But I disagree that it's like already set. And I say this because of this really fascinating thing that was mentioned at 222B, the part that James actually read out loud earlier. So he says, so the visitor says, you know, there, I'll just read this like short paragraph again. There is, if human, okay, so Theaetetus asks, is there any such thing as hunting tame animals? Which is, I thought was a funny question. And then the visitor says, there is, if human beings are tame animals at any rate. Make whichever assumption you like. Either there are tame animals, or there are no, or there are tame animals, but humans are wild, or else you'll say humans are tame but aren't hunted. Specify whichever you prefer to say. And then Theaetetus says, well, I think we're tame animals, and I'll say humans are in fact hunted. So this is totally fascinating to me because, first of all, this method is used in many of the dialogues, right? As we see, as many of us might know. But here, the visitor, okay, I think personally, I think the visitor is supposed to represent Plato himself. Like Plato never actually appears in any dialogues. Like I think this is my hypothesis. I'll go. I can. This is another topic. I'll just leave aside for now. But I think personally, I think the visitor is Plato himself. Like he never actually puts himself in the dialogue. So this is maybe as far as he goes. But he hides himself here. But to me, it's fascinating because if the visitor is Plato, or even if the visitor isn't Plato, that's sort of a side point right now. But the idea that it's up to Theaetetus to decide how he wants to draw the distinction is fascinating. It's not so this it means a dialogue, although it's arbitrary in a way, it's not preset, as Jose said, that it's not like meant to manipulate him or whatever. Because he's leaving it up to Theaetetus how he wants to divide it, and then he'll grab those distinctions, and then he'll just keep making more distinctions further down. So this actually sort of emphasizes that it's arbitrary, right? That it's up to the other person how he wants it. So it actually emphasizes all the more Jose's point that it's arbitrary, but but it also points out that it's not like to a preset destination. Which I think is just a very interesting general remark about the method that we see in so many of these dialogues, that maybe although we're drawing all these distinctions, maybe there's different ways to get to the same point, or maybe, something else is going on. So that's just my observations for now. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And that's, I think you said a lot of interesting things there, starting with giving a clear picture of options. And maybe that's one thing that this does. By dividing only by two, it gives a clearer picture than more multiples of division. And then I think you picked up on those words, actually, pick whichever you choose. And maybe that's helpful to understand this method of collection and division, is that you can pick whichever two things you want to compare, and then just keep working through those comparisons to find some sort of common thread. So maybe that's some of the power of this. And when you said that it's not set in advance, I think that's also maybe very helpful to understand this. But I think we still need to grapple with this potential that it is arbitrary. But maybe as you said, it's that each of us sees the name in a different way. So each of us thinks about expertise in a different way. And so whenever we do any sort of comparison in some sort of verbal process, which is what the visitor said is very important, like we can't just agree that expert means something set in advance. We have to work it out. We have to talk it out. We have to arrive at some verbal agreement before there is any understanding of what expert actually is. So I think that was very helpful. Thank you for that.
Can I just jump in one more point?
Yeah.
Just quick point. So some of these issues we're concerned about already about the method that James is getting us to think about. As we see, for those of us who read the dialogue, as we see, just after this point, we revisit this trail, and we start going down other paths, and we find the Sophist under other paths too. So in other distinctions, you can make down these different paths. So maybe that actually solves some of our misgivings about this method, in that this is not the end point. Like you're like, oh, but the Sophist is sort of sometimes does this other thing, and these distinctions don't work. Well, maybe we don't have to be so worried about that if the method also means that we can go down other trails too and find distinctions elsewhere, because we find the Sophist down 6 other trails or 5 other trails, I believe. So maybe that will help us, not be so concerned about these little or about these issues that seem to arise right now. So that's it.
A good point. So the question is, does this method give us that flexibility? And you've raised, where we end today's reading is where they set out the 6 different characteristics of a sophist. So yeah, it's not just one characteristic, it's multiple. So, well, thank you for that. And we'll go to Jose and Moshe and JK.
Okay, I was just wanting to mention that I read some commentator about this dialogue, and I kind of agree with what he says. He says that in this dialogue, there are parts of the dialogue that the visitor he's being a sophist in the arguments, because it seems that kind of Plato is making fun of us, the reader, because he's using sophist techniques, and especially in this part of the dialogue, like he's presenting this. There is a fallacy here. There is the fallacy of the false dichotomy, that he presents only 2 choices as possible, and could be another choice. So he forces you to choose one or the other, and he's guiding you in the way. So this is what Jose Ayur said, that he's guiding you. I agree. Now, in this moment that he says, "Oh, this land about to humans, they are wild or tame." Well, here doesn't matter, because if he say wild, he said, "Oh, the humans are wild." But anyway, the continuation is for humans anyway. So it doesn't matter what he chooses. He will go to humans anyway if he shows that humans are tame or humans are wild. So he's conducting the interlocutor like, as a sophist would do. Anyway, this is one comment. And another thing is what J.K. say about if Socrates is a sophist. Well, there is a big difference that they do not mention. Socrates always, time and time again, he says that he doesn't pretend to know anything. Yeah, he's a little bit when he says that I don't know anything, and the sophists, they pretend that they know, and they don't know. And later in the dialogue, he says that this is the worst thing that can happen. It's not the ignorance, it's the ignorance of thinking that they know something when they don't really know. I think this is a big difference with Socrates and at the end of this lecture, not the dialogue, sorry. You mentioned that. So I wanted to mention that.
That's a good point. And yeah, that part was at 229C, where the visitor says, "I think I see a large, difficult type of ignorance marked off from the others and overshadowing all of them. Not knowing, but thinking that you know. That's what probably causes all of the mistakes we make when we think." I think that's an important point, an important distinction, I think, that you raised, Jose. So thank you for that. And the idea of the, there's also at I think it's around 218C or D. He's talking about finding the thing itself and not the name. And then at 231A, he says, beware of similarities. For example, the dog and the wolf are, from the same family or from the same general category of animal, but they're very different. One is wild, the wolf, and then the dog is tame. So I think that's maybe trying to illustrate that, being aware of similarities. And, this whole process of division is really to, I think, to identify the general from the particulars. So there's all sorts of particulars as you go down this chain, but the general thing is expertise. And so maybe that's part of what this process is about. So you raised some very good thoughts there. Thank you. We'll go to Moshe and JK and Jose G and Steve. Moshe.
Okay. I don't think the distinctions that are being made here are arbitrary, but I do think that the divisions that are being made here are self-serving. And the person who's making the distinctions is making these distinctions so he can prove his own point. And I think that the thing that Aaron pointed out, and you did too, James, at 222, yes, if you include man under tame animals, well, that's a huge generalization all by itself. But if you like, you may say that there are no tame animals, or that if there are, man is not among them. Or you may say that man is a tame animal, but he is not hunted. You shall decide which of these alternatives you prefer. The Sophists, I think we have to be sensitive to the histrionics that are apparent here. There's a drama going on here, and the drama is in words. And the Sophist is saying, you shall decide which of these alternatives you prefer. He could have concluded that by saying, it doesn't matter to me because I'm going to get my point regardless. If you want to accept this, fine. If you don't want to accept that, fine. We'll simply go, I'll simply go whatever way you suggest because I'm still going to get to the same point. The second thing that I want to observe about this is that if we want to test this analysis, one way of doing it is running it backward. Can I go from the distinction between for pleasure and for virtue and get all the way back to the angler? I mean, we started out with the angler, and from the angler, we've gone all the way down to this thing about teaching knowledge of virtue. Well, if this is a good analysis, I should be able to show how I can go backward every step and get back to Joe, who's standing in the stream with his hip boots on. But if I can't get back there, if I get back to Sally, or if I get back to a giraffe, my analysis breaks down. So I just want to point out those two things, that the sophist, the stranger, is a sophist, and it doesn't matter to him which direction you go. And that if you want to understand his analysis, try working backwards if you can get from knowledge of virtue to the end.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting idea, that working backward. So that this analysis should work both ways, forward and backward. I think that's really fascinating. That maybe just talking about the process of logic, like logic should work any way you run it. And I'm wondering, if the division in two helps with that or not. But I think we're still, contending with whether these divisions are appropriate or whether there's other divisions that could be made. And as you asked, is the visitor a sophist himself, even though he's not charging for this, he's not charging any money, but is he trying to take possession, or is he trying to acquire somebody's thoughts through actions and words? So I think that's a point that we need to address. It's an important point.
In some parts of the dialogue, he acts as a sophist, but not in other parts. In other parts, right. It's very logical.
Right.
So this is why this idea that Plato is playing with us, having sometimes a visitor behaving as a sophist,
Mm-hmm.
and very serious, because he's a philosopher. He's not presented as a sophist, as a philosopher, a follower of Parmenides.
Right.
Can I just jump in with remark on that comment? Just a quick remark. So Jose was just saying that, like, sometimes he's being logical, so he's not being a sophist. So he's saying that there's different sort of modes of discussion that goes on, that will happen in this dialogue, which happens I think in almost all the dialogues. You see different modes of discussion with Socrates. So my point then is that it's just that, well, that distinction doesn't really identify who's a philosopher or the sophist, in my view, because I think you'll see that in many of the dialogues featuring sophists, like Gorgias and Protagoras and so on, or Hippias. that sophists know how to use logic too. In fact, they're quite clever at using reason and logic, but somehow not quite the way the philosopher should be using logic and logical distinctions and analysis. So sophists, it's not like sophists can't be logical. In fact, the danger of sophistry and sophists is that they are actually very smart people. Like Protagoras is supposed to be like, if you read Protagoras, you see that he's actually in a way admired. In a way, he's supposed to be one of the greatest sophists. He's a brilliant person, and but so that's all I want to say. Like, I agree that there's something to do with like the philosopher, something to do with reason, but the relationship between the philosopher and reason, and how we draw the distinction between the philosopher and sophist is got pretty blurry actually when logic is an issue.
And that's a good point. Thank you. And I think that's
well, the philosopher. Well, there is a distinction there later as well in the dialogue that the main distinction. Yes, I know both. They can use logic and they are smart and everything, but the main huge difference is that the philosopher goes after the truth, and the sophists, they go to win the arguments or to manipulate people by persuasion. That's the big difference. So I know that they are smart. And now another thing is that I think Plato in the dialogue, he respects a lot, especially Gorgias and Protagoras. I read more dialogue, but there are many other sophists that they are like really bad.
Yeah, so I think that sophists are not all necessarily that bad, but certainly this process of dialogue and reaching some verbal agreement is very critical to whatever viewpoint that we're going to examine. So that's something that is made very clear at the beginning of this dialogue. We'll go to JK and Jose G, and then Steve.
Yeah, I think this is a very naturalistic and logical chain of division. And so I think it goes to show that there's really no distinction, or you can't see a clear distinction in this kind of between a sophist and the philosopher. And it's to show that they both are expertise, or they have expertise. And maybe they're both relying on using the methods that are, similar in argumentation. And but the main difference is that the purpose. What is the purpose of the sophist, right? And both the philosopher and the sophist may be making a living, right? They're both making a living. Of course, Socrates is not, but he is an expert, and he is kind of participating in the marketplace, and he is doing practicing this kind of acquisition, right? Hunting of youth, right? And so, what is the difference? The difference is really just tells us at the end that the sophist is in it for pleasure, and the philosopher is distinct from that because he's in it for virtue. And basically, that's the dividing line between what between the sophist and the philosopher. The philosopher is concerned with what is above the dividing line, right? The sophist is in this below the dividing line of doing what he's doing for the purpose of pleasure. And I think that's what this this chain of division shows. One is for virtue, the other one is for pleasure.
Yeah, for pleasure, and I guess for money as well. And maybe it's a question again of whether virtue can in fact be taught. And the sophist claims to be able to teach virtue. But as I asked in the introduction, where did the sophist learn virtue in the first place, and what qualifies him to teach virtue? So it's an important question. We'll go to Jose G, and then Steve, and then Darren.
This is such an interesting topic. that I don't know where to start from. But a couple of things. If I'm a sophist, and James, you are a philosopher, we would approach the same question from two different angles. If I'm a sophist, I would do exactly this. I would say, how can I convince the audience of point A? I would start from the middle of the labyrinth and find my way out, and then make my argument that way. I would say, well, let's split this in two, because as I said, it's already a prefabricated path that would lead me to success. However, you, James, you would start from the other end. If you're the philosopher, you would start with a question that says, is getting paid for persuasion virtuous? So that's the way of the philosopher. It would start from the end, but not from the end. It would start from the beginning, from the key question. Whereas a sophist would start from, how do I get this person to believe A or B or C? If you analyze the argument of both, let's say we both go to the marketplace under the porticus, and I speak first and then you speak next, James, and somebody there listening like Jose Jacob will start analyzing, okay, let's see what this guy said versus the other guy said. And you will find three clear differences. That me, as a sophist, use three tricks. One, not three tricks. I used fallacious arguments, and James, as Socrates, did not. I use emotion, right? I rip my shirt apart and I cry and whatever. I used emotions to persuade, whereas James didn't. He used logic. Right? And to the point that Daring was mentioning, I don't believe that the sophists were very smart, but I don't believe they were logical. They couldn't be. Right? They couldn't be logical because they used all these fallacious arguments that appear to be true. Right? So they couldn't be, they are, I'm sure if you ask them, give me the good logic of this, he would say, well, James, come over here, and in secret, I would tell you really what the right logic is, and you would agree with him. But in public, they paid me to convince the audience to believe this. So therefore, I had to do that. Anyway, that's a comment. But this is an interesting topic.
Yeah, for sure, and certainly, the illogic in the argument of the sophists is something that I think we're being told we have to be careful of here, and certainly the emotion that you mentioned, and this method of controversy that the sophist will engage in to propel people to his position, I think is something that one has to be aware of it. And you made an interesting point, Jose, about starting at the end versus starting at the beginning. The philosopher starts at the beginning with the question, and the sophist starts at the end with the goal, which is something I think similar to what J.K. was saying, that it's the end goal of the sophist that's important here. So yeah, thank you for that. And we'll go to Steve and then Darren.
I don't see a lot of difference between the method the Sophists use and the method that Socrates uses. I think that what I'm noticing is perhaps a cognitive bias that we're come at it right away with the idea that the sophist is bad. So we're looking at a lot of the negative qualities of the sophist's argument. Sophist is selling, in my view, a tool. And it's a tool on how to be persuasive. And he's using a lot of the methods that, the exact same methods that Socrates used in, like Socrates was looking at the difference between tall and short, between physical and mental. And it wasn't the, this whole division and collection. So it's not the, we didn't pick apart to the same degree what Socrates was saying, although we did talk quite a while about tallness and trying to get into that. But I think that there's a little bit of, and Socrates often uses some devices in order to prod people along. He plays devil's advocate all the time. He's dumb like a fox, as they say, or smart like a fox, whichever the correct statement is. But he'll act like he knows less, and he'll try to goad on. So he's using all of these rhetorical tools. So just because it's just compared to selling a knife. You could sell a knife, and somebody could use it. A surgeon can use it to help save people's lives, or somebody could use it to stab and kill somebody. So a lot of just wanted to from my viewing of the dialogue is not to get the old phrase, don't confuse your finger with the moon at the moon. When you're pointing at the moon, you don't want to be looking at the finger and talking about the finger. The idea is the moon. So I think that the focus is on the point that the sophist in this case is trying to make, or Plato's trying to make through the sophist, is not that whether the sophist's trade is good or bad. It's what the ideas, the philosophical ideas that they're examining. Thanks.
And that's an important point, I think, Steve, to understand actually that it's not that Plato is trying to say that the sophist is good or bad. What they're trying to do here is to actually hunt the sophist, to identify the sophist, so that at least we know what we're dealing with, and then we can decide whether the sophist is good or bad. But the important thing is to know, what we're dealing with, and that's because it's more important to know what a thing is than to know the name of the thing. So somebody is an expert, well, that's the name that's applied to somebody, but what is that actual expertise? And that's the focus. And I think that was a very helpful point that you made about that, is to understand the focus. And here they're trying to hunt the sophist, to identify the sophist, and then they can assess whether the knowledge that is being sold is good knowledge or bad. So thank you for that. We'll go to Darren and then Moshe.
I like what you just said there, James, about the point about we're not just interested in the words, but what they actually are. I think that's a potential confusion when we look at this method, when we just seem to be just dissecting words. But there's always this effort to try to get back to the actual substance of things. So again, I have so many thoughts, but I think I'll just make a general comment about what we've been discussing, the distinction between a sophist and the philosopher. And I'll just say one thing in response to something someone said earlier about how the sophist makes. Oh, yeah, right. I mentioned before how I think the sophist does use logic and reason, and that's what makes them dangerous, and that's what makes people fall for them. And I think someone remarked that they disagreed because the sophist, it's a philosopher. Like, the sophist actually makes what seems like arguments, but they're fallacious arguments, and the philosopher is the one who who's using logic and argumentation correctly. So I just want to point out this observation, though. Okay, and this comes back to what I think the difficulty of drawing the distinction. And I think this difficulty is recognized by Plato, and it's recognized in this very dialogue at various points, that it's actually very hard to draw the distinction. Although I think Plato is convinced there is a distinction. And I think most of us are convinced that there's a distinction because there are people like sophists out there. And I think distinction is obvious when you look at very like unintelligent sophists, the more vain sophists. Like I if you've never read the Hippias dialogues, I highly recommend them, the two Hippias dialogues, because they're hilarious. Because Hippias is a really dumb sophist, and he just makes he does definitely make errors all the time. But this is not always the case with sophists. Like sophists are different. They're not one person, and they have different personalities. Some of them are more vain than others. Some of them actually seem to, have like something like virtue, even if they wouldn't, even if they seem to be good people in a way. I think Protagoras is a good example of that. And some of them are really intelligent. And so I think the distinction doesn't really hold, because in the Hippias Minor, I was actually trying to find this quote, so I'm sort of frazzled right now. I wasn't successful, but in this Hippias Minor, Socrates actually says, so that dialogue is about lying and how it's possible, like, to lie or not to lie, and what is a lie. And Socrates actually admits to being saying wrong things or saying lies all the time, and how difficult it is to not say lies, and I think this points to how, like, even someone who is a philosopher will make mistakes all the time. And this is something Socrates also admits in that dialogue, that he makes mistakes all the time. Like, it's so easy to, in philosophy, that you think you made a right analysis, you think you made a right distinction, but actually someone else, if anyone's, if you've been in a philosophy classroom, you'll see how easy it is for someone to point you, oh, but you can think about this other way, and then it seems like you might be wrong after all. So philosophy is hard. And so even the philosopher would make mistakes and make fallacious arguments all the time. So this isn't, and Socrates even says as much in the Hippias Minor. So I just want to point out how much blurrier, like how hard this distinction really is, and how, like, just looking at how logical they are, like, won't really help, I think, because some philosophers make mistakes all the time, and sophists can be very logical. That's how they convince people. Even sometimes they even fool philosophers. Like some people, I think, like some people call David Hume a sophist. I think what's that famous paper by modern? It's called Modern Moral Philosophy, but Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe. Like she outright declares in that paper, in that very famous paper, that David Hume is a sophist. David Hume, the philosopher, she thinks is a sophist. Okay, so this just goes to tell you that, like, these words, it's very hard to, like, tell. And just one last thing I will say quickly on page 3 of the dialogue. I say that's my page 3. So this is the very beginning of the dialogue. At 216C. So here, like, this is sort of explicit in this very dialogue itself, how, like, the philosopher also hides, like, the sophist. So I just really like this quote in general. So Socrates says, and that's the right thing for you to do, my friend, but probably it's no easier, I imagine, to distinguish that kind of person than it is to distinguish gods. So they're talking about philosophers here, I believe. Yeah. So certainly the genuine philosophers who haunt our cities, by contrast to the fake ones, take on all sorts of different appearances just because of other people's ignorance. As philosophers look down from above at the lives of those below them, some people think they're worthless and others think they're worth everything in the world. Sometimes they take on the appearance of statesmen, and sometimes of sophists. Sometimes, too, they might give the impression that they're completely insane. But it's all right with our visitor. I'll be glad to have him tell us what the people where he comes from used to apply the following names to. Okay, and then they go on to their discussion. But here, like, it's this totally fascinating point here, how the sophist might actually seem insane to some people, and sometimes appears to be a statesman, sometimes appears to be a sophist himself. So I think, again, this is just emphasizing the point that, like, how it's very hard to tell the difference. And how actually in the dialogue preceding this one, so this is the sophist, the dialogue, the one it's supposed to be part of a trilogy. I think Theaetetus came before. In the Theaetetus, there's this, almost right in the middle of that dialogue, that very long dialogue, Socrates talks about how the philosopher, like, describes how the philosopher could appear crazy and insane to other people. So that's another great point. That's another great place to look.
Yeah. Well, Thanks for that, and certainly, understanding the appearance of something versus what something actually is. That was a good quote that you raised just from the beginning there, and I'd make the point here too. There's a section at 230A that we'll maybe get to in a few minutes that I wanted to cover, and that's the idea of teaching. There's a few different ways of teaching, and I think one of them addresses what you were talking about, Darren, the idea of following logical consistency to identify whether we're dealing with a sophist or not. So that's something that we'll get to. But I wanted to raise that in the context of the presentation of the soul in this dialogue. So that's maybe the section that we could look at next. So, but thank you for that. And we'll go to Moshe and Jose G, and then JK.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize what Darren just said at that first section. Homer is saying that these spirits hover over the cities, and they sometimes appear as philosophers, statesmen, or sophists. But what he's saying there, just to be clear, is that a true philosopher can be mistaken for a sophist. He can be mistaken for a statesman, and he can even be mistaken for a philosopher. Another point in the text and also in the analysis is that I'm concentrating on the word hunt. The stranger is talking about hunting, and he's talking about secret hunting and open combat, and he has lifeless targets and living targets. And hunting is equivocal. Okay, James, you used it in a different sense a few minutes ago when you were talking about hunting as discerning or identifying. But there's another kind of hunting too, which is just purely acquisition. You take the guy with the bow and arrow out in the field, and he's trying to get some dinner, and he shoots the rabbit. Okay, he's trying to acquire that rabbit. He's not identifying it. So I think we have to be clear when we're using the word hunting. And I want to bring that back to the distinction that we're struggling with here. And it's at least helpful to me, and maybe it's helpful to other people too, between the sophist, who we are trying to identify, and Socrates, who we've at least given the titular title of a philosopher. And the distinction between the two of them is in how they approach things. For one thing, it says in the dialogue that the sophist is a hunter for the youth. He's looking for crowds of people who he can persuade. Okay? And Socrates never hunted out anybody. The youth were attracted to him, and they flocked to him voluntarily. He wasn't looking for them. The second thing is that the sophist has knowledge for sale. It says at 224, one is descriptive of the sale of knowledge of virtue, and the other the sale of other kinds of knowledge. So that the sophist is selling knowledge, and Socrates never claimed to have knowledge. In fact, he went to great lengths to dispute the oracle, who said that he was the wisest of all men. So those two things help me keep in mind the difference between a philosopher and a sophist. And maybe there are no true philosophers except for Socrates, but I think that's helpful in understanding what's going on in this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what you said is very helpful too. That the philosopher understands his limits and his ignorance, I guess, to acknowledge that, whereas the sophist doesn't acknowledge his ignorance or the things that he doesn't know. I think that's an important distinction to make, and I think very helpful. We'll go to Jose G and then JK.
Yeah, I will pass, James. I heard a lot about what I wanted to mention.
Okay.
So,
right. Thank you. We'll go to JK then.
Yeah, I want to reinforce Darren's point about this kind of inability to distinguish between a sophist and a philosopher. and that the sophist could very well be someone who has a different point of view, right, about what is truth, right? And so, of course, he's making a living, and today we go to universities and we have to pay money for for knowledge, right, to learn. Are the professors who are getting paid to teach us, supposedly what the truth is? Are they sophists or are they philosophers, right? So the distinction is not that clear, and this notion of the sophist is one point of view. But if you were at that time, the Socrates was condemned, for corrupting the youth, and he was seen as a sophist. So maybe at that time, where he was in the marketplace, it was difficult to make that distinction. And of course, Socrates claimed that he doesn't really know. No, but at the same time, he's also leading his followers, to a certain kind of truth, right, about the soul, about the virtue, and about pleasure, and so forth. And so there are philosophers who are taking the point of view that that is very distinct from Plato's point of view about virtue. Perhaps pleasure is a kind of is a certain truth that that we can't really dispute, right? Sigmund Freud, he was this first psychologist, wrote very philosophically, and he was advocating this point of view that the pleasure principle is what it's all about. And so was Freud a sophist of sorts? But so I think that that's a good argument, that there is really no distinction, no clear distinction between a philosopher and a sophist. Look at all the different philosophers that have come after or before Plato, Heraclitus and Parmenides, and all the ones after, who have different points of view. Are they all sophists because they had a different point of view of what virtue or truth is? So yeah, I think that's a very good point that Darren made. I agree with that.
Thanks, and yeah, definitely something that we need to come to grips with. What is the dividing line between philosopher and sophist? And you mentioned, JK, that Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth, and I guess there's a bit of an irony here in this, that the sophist is the visitor is saying that the sophist may be corrupting the youth. The sophist is going out and hunting in these meadows of wealthy youths, selling a product that isn't necessarily a good product. So I think there's a bit of irony in that, that because Socrates was condemned for that, and at least Socrates acknowledged his ignorance. We'll go to Jose J, and then I've got a reading on the screen here if everybody can see it. So maybe we'll do this reading afterwards. But Jose.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One thing is that basically Socrates was condemned for being a sophist. And he wasn't a sophist, but he was condemned, as James mentioned before. Well, another big distinction between the philosopher and the philosopher considering Plato and and the sophists is that the sophists, they were subjectivist in the sense that they claim that everybody can have a different concept of virtues. Like examples of that you can see, for example, in the Republic, in Book 1, when he asks for what is the definition of justice. And there is this, I don't remember the name, Taramacus is a big, he's a sophist. and he has concept that is whatever is good for me. This is justice. I don't care. And so they have this concept that you can teach people to have their own concept of virtues. And as an opposite, like Plato, he was a objectivist. So the theory of the forms, for sure, like the concept of justice is only one and it's universal. You cannot have different concept of justice according to whatever I want to think, and even sell this idea. That was another huge difference of between philosophers and sophists.
And thanks for the use of that term subjectivist. And maybe this is part of, I asked at the beginning what, if there's examples of modern sophistry, and maybe, those who say that anybody's ideas are of the same value as anybody else's ideas, that concept is maybe out there now that may not be the case, right? It's not just because somebody has an idea doesn't make that idea equally valid to anybody else's idea. And you use the example of justice from the Republic that we discussed, and I think that's maybe a good example. Is that that's something that we need to talk about and reach some sort of agreement in a process of dialectic. And just because somebody has a view of what justice is doesn't make that view equally valid to anybody else's view. So that's I think the point or one of the key points that's being made in this dialogue is that it has to be the word, whether it's justice or something else, needs to be discussed and agreed upon. It just we can't just take it for granted that it means something that it's completely subjective. So thank you for that. We'll go to a motion and then JK.
I have to take issue with what JK said about philosophers and sophists. First of all, I want to point out that the modern university has ruined philosophy. Philosophy was never meant to become what we know as academic philosophy in the modern university. Philosophy was something that was handed down from master to student, for a very long time, thousands of years. And it was not something that has been perverted into a scientific model where you have to publish new research in philosophy, as if the idea that we could have philosophical breakthroughs is anything but laughable. The idea that because philosophers have different points of view, to identify them as sophists or to question whether that's sophistry because they have different points of view is like questioning whether Aristotle and Newton were both scientific because they had different points of view about what gravity was. And the same thing for Einstein and Heisenberg because they had a different idea about how the universe unfolded. Does that make them non-scientists? Does that make them non-physicists? Absolutely not. So I'm just to me that kind of distinction I think is unfair. And so I apologize for pressing a hot button, but it did, and I wanted to express it.
Thanks, and we can explore that, and certainly the idea of the modern teaching of philosophy is something that I think is worthy of discussion. I'd like to learn more about how it's approached, because I'm not schooled in philosophy. I'm just an amateur philosopher, but I wonder whether a lot of sophistry now is enabled by the fact that knowledge is being split up into so many different areas, different categories of knowledge. And because in the ancient times, the philosopher was, a bit of a polymath, knew all sorts of different areas of knowledge and was able to combine them. Whereas now, knowledge of math and knowledge of geometry and knowledge of history and knowledge of language and all of those different pieces of knowledge are spread among, people of different expertises. And so, maybe a thought that we can explore too is knowledge being divided too finely now to really be able to pinpoint who the experts are in these. So thanks for that point, and we'll go to JK.
Yeah, I wanted to, just add on to the add that this distinction is not is very difficult, right, to be made between sophistry and true philosophy. And like you said, that it's really more complicated today. So that you need to also have some understanding of science. Dismiss science, but at the same time, science can also lead you down a rabbit hole of detail and expertise that you would never be able to perhaps master and get your head around. Mm-hmm. But so it is a difficult thing, to distinguish, because there are so many different points of philosophy, different philosophies that are divergent from one another. And so, yeah, it's so you wouldn't call someone a sophist just because their point of view disagreed with yours, or right? But you have to also make the have some understanding of the differences, right, and be able to see what the relationships are in order to tell whether it's a true point of view that can help you understand what the ultimate truth is. So yeah. So an example was someone like Kant's philosophy, where he says that you can't know the truth because it's out of your ability of a reason to understand what the truth is, right? The thing in itself, the reality. At the same time, you depend on your reason to determine what the truth is, and your reason can judge your reasons for understanding that the truth, that you can't understand what the truth is. So it's a kind of it's very, very, it's very difficult. And I'm not saying it's a simple thing because there's so many, different philosophies that you have to grapple with.
And I think you raised an important point in that we need to understand the differences, and maybe that's a key thing. Certainly a theme that goes through Plato is the distinction between the same and the different. And if we don't know what a thing is, maybe looking at the differences, to go back to what Jose G, I think, said earlier, to take opposing viewpoints and find the differences and then somehow reconcile those differences. And I think that seems to me a little bit what they're trying to do with the method of collection and division here. So we'll go to Jose G, and then let's do this reading, I think, that I've got on the screen here. So Jose.
Yeah, just wanted to mention about what you just said and what JK said. Yeah, it is definitely difficult to distinguish different point of views, but it is difficult if you're looking or intending to find who to believe. And that is difficult if you want to choose one. And that's where this method that I was describing and that James just recalled, that it is not a matter of choosing who to believe. It's a matter of understanding one argument, understanding the other argument, and see if you can discern, in your opinion, who has better arguments. So it boils down, believe it or not, to being a critical thinker in areas where it matters. You cannot be a critical thinker on everything that you read in a newspaper, right? That would make sense. But in things that really matter to you individually, you collect points of view, mainly opposite point of views. And if you really want to form your own informed opinion, you do use critical thinking and decide who has better arguments. And the number of matters, it doesn't matter. It's not that important. And I remember one thing I read, a couple of mundane comments that people make sometimes about, well, let's agree to disagree. You probably have heard that when you're discussing something. And at one point, somebody proposed that let's agree to disagree. And I say, well, that's what I call epistemic irresponsibility. You haven't gotten anywhere. Right? Why did you start discussing it anyway? I think both parties are responsible to say, okay, let's stop here. We'll continue this discussion. I think I need to to read more about this, you need to read more about that. Let's continue the discussion to try to find the best informed judgment, because trying to find the truth, the ultimate truth, is probably difficult, if not impossible. But you can always have a more informed opinion. So yes, there are point of views. Yes, there are professors at university. Yes, all the philosophers have different point of views. That doesn't mean that you cannot have your own. That's all I'm saying. I mean, but it boils down to, this is what I was trying to say in different words. If we focus on the claim of one philosopher versus the claim of the other philosopher, then it's like a food fight, right? Because you say, I don't agree with that. Well, I don't agree with that. So then what's next? It's only a few punches or a few insults. But if you say, okay, I got it. Now, what makes him believe? In other words, what is his argument? And what is your argument? Then we don't need to throw pizzas at each other. We can, okay, well, let me not be responsible for my take on this thing. Because when you debate claims or assertions or conclusions or therefores, you're just in a food fight. You have to go back to the argument. Just to reinforce that point that I mentioned at the beginning, just get to opposing arguments and analyze them.
I think you said that well, Jose, that critical thinking requires that we understand each other and engage in this process of dialectic that is being proposed here. The food fights that you talked about, I think we see that a lot today. And I'm thinking, example of modern sophistry might be some of these cable news commentators, that say mine is the only correct point of view and this is the way you should think, and they're being paid a lot of money for this, and they don't tolerate other opinions. And I think that's where the whole thing needs to be opened up, and that we hear each other's points. And as JK I think was saying earlier, just to understand the differences and to be able to be willing to reconcile those differences.
It reminds me, if I may, James, it reminds me of a funny anecdote that says, if you're debating an argument and you have a good argument, you have good, solid evidence for your facts, it says, well, use your argument. If your argument is weak, right, or not well researched, start screaming, start raising your voice, start screaming, get louder, get more threatening. If you definitely don't have the facts or the arguments, he says, well, jump on the table and start accusing the other guy of being a communist or a traitor or whatever, right? So that's the 3 degrees of, I guess, of persuasion. Anyway.
And that's a good point, yeah.
Yeah, so the facts matter, right? So you do have to take a kind of a scientific, method. Use a scientific method to for your arguments. At the same time, science is also saying things that are very, very maybe sophistic when they claim that there's no free will because everything is determined, and then you have to question, and look for that other point of view, which claims that there is free will. There are philosophers that say that posit that there is a free will, and here's the arguments for it. So.
And I think certainly, as Jose was saying, if you feel the strength in your argument, then you shouldn't be afraid to debate civilly with others and present your point. It's I think we have to understand that and keep that in mind, that I think those who scream loudest are the ones who are probably least convinced of their own position. So I've got this reading. We've only got a little bit less than 20 minutes left here, but I've got this reading from 227E to 228E on the screen. I don't know if everybody can see this on the screen. And the idea, one of the things in here that struck me was this word proportion. So in this section, it's talking about the nature of the soul and 2 kinds of badness that affect the soul. So again, this notion of 2. again. And the visitor starts to say, we have to say that there are two kinds of badness that affect the soul. One is like bodily sickness, and the other is like ugliness. Theotetus says, I don't understand. The visitor says, presumably you regard sickness and discord as the same thing, don't you? Do you think that discord is just dissension among things that are naturally of the same kind and arises out of some kind of corruption? Theotetus says, yes. The visitor says, and ugliness is precisely a consistently unattractive sort of disproportion. Theotetus says, yes. The visitor goes on, well, then don't we see that there's dissension in the souls of people in poor condition between beliefs and desires, angers and pleasures, reason and pain, and all of those things with each other? Theotetus says, absolutely. The visitor says, but all of them do have to be akin to each other. So we'd be right if we said that wickedness is discord and sickness of the soul. Theotetus says, absolutely right. Visitor says, well, then suppose something that's in motion aims at a target and tries to hit it, but on every try passes by it and misses. Are we going to say that it does this properly because it's properly proportioned or because it's out of proportion? Theotetus says, out of proportion, obviously. And the visitor goes on, but we do know that no soul is willingly ignorant of anything. But ignorance occurs precisely when a soul tries for the truth, but swerves aside from understanding and so is beside itself. So we have to take it that an ignorant soul is ugly and out of proportion. Then there are, it appears, these two kinds of badness in the soul. Most people call one of them wickedness, but it's obviously a disease of the soul. They call the other one ignorance, but if it occurs only in a person's soul, they aren't willing to agree that it's a form of badness. And so, this may bring us back to some of the discussion that we had when we looked at the Phaedo and the nature of the soul. One thing that interested me in here was the word proportion and disproportion, and it appears 5 times in this section. And it made me think about that method of collection and division in that everything is being divided by 2. So everything is in equal portions. And here he's saying that if the soul gets out of proportion, maybe losing its balance, this is what causes badness in the soul. So there's both loss of proportion and discord. So discord is being out of balance with itself. This is one of the things that he's warning about, is that the soul can be corrupted by these discord and being out of proportion. And then he goes on at 2:30, and I'll just read this section at 2:38. It's short. And this is the method of teaching that can get around this, that can help to cure this discord and this being out of proportion. He says, so the visitor says at 2:30a, or one part of the kind of teaching that's done in words is a rough road, and the other part is smoother. One of them is our forefathers' time-honored method of scolding or gently encouraging. They used to employ it especially on their sons, and many still use it on them nowadays when they do something wrong. Admonition would be the right thing to call all of this. So that's one method of teaching, by admonition. And then he says, as for the other part, some people seem to have an argument to give themselves that lack of learning is always involuntary, and that if someone thinks he's wise, he'll never be willing to learn anything about what he thinks he's clever at. And I think we see examples of that now, that if somebody thinks he's wise, he'll never be willing to learn anything about what he thinks he's clever at. These people think that though admonition is a lot of work, it doesn't do much good. And then he goes on to say that, so then cross-examining someone when he thinks he's saying something, though he's saying nothing, since his opinions will vary inconsistently, this cross-examination process of teaching is one way that will reveal that illogic in the soul. And so I just wanted to get some thoughts on this, and the effect of this sophistry on the soul, and whether this method of teaching, not necessarily admonition, which is saying I'm right and you're wrong, but this cross-examination process, which is maybe what they were doing with that method of division and collection, a bit of a cross-examination, looking for some proportion between 2 opposite points. And so just get some thoughts on this. Jose.
No, so you didn't finish this one, but anyway, like I don't think that this dialectic way of teaching. I don't think he's referring to this division. He's referring to the method that Socrates used against the people that pretend that know something and they don't know anything. Because in the dialogue later, he's saying that you have to challenge them and kind of ridicule them, so they will learn that they don't know what they pretend to know. I think this is the method called like elencos. And yeah, this is my thought about this section. But at the end, saying how serious is the worst thing is to not ignorance, because you might not know something, but the kind of things that you think that you know and you don't really know, and you pretend that you know. This is the basic. So these people you have to unmask, and probably in public, like Socrates did. And this is why one of the reasons he was condemned to death. But I think this is what is meaning in this part of the dialogue.
I like that term, unmasking, and I think that the two different methods of teaching, that the sophist would use one method, but the unmasking method is the method of cross-examination. I think is something that maybe is helpful to think of in the approach, the approach to unmasking. We'll go to Moshe and then Darren.
When the stranger says, well, then don't we see that there's dissension in the souls of people in poor condition between beliefs and desires, anger and pleasures, reason and pains, and all of those things with each other? Well, when I read that, I thought those were clear distinctions. Beliefs and desires, why isn't the distinction between beliefs and knowledge? Anger and pleasures, why isn't it between pain and pleasure? Reason and pains, why isn't it between reason and animal instinct or irrationality and all those other things? To go back to what I'd said before, I think the distinctions that the stranger, the visitor, is making are not as arbitrary as they are self-serving, because he makes these particular distinctions, I think, in order to be able to talk further about this property of being, being in proportion. One of the things that I want to say about being in proportion is that it's not universal. To quote, to remind us of Aristotle, all excess is vice except for the pursuit of virtue. Okay, so that kind of disproportion can be something that is good in the soul. So I think we'd have to take a look at each one of these cases and find out if there's not a counterexample for what he's saying about, certainly there are some cases where ugly and out of proportion are the ways. I mean, you want to analyze ugly in terms of out of proportion, but there are other cases where ugly wouldn't require being out of proportion at all. So I just want to be careful about what I take to be the self-serving nature of these distinctions and actual distinctions in fact.
Right. And then I'm just highlighting here on the screen, the part that you talked about. And so, is comparing beliefs and desires, anger and pleasures, reason and pains. Are these correct or logical comparisons? And so that's it's something that, is he being self-serving to get the conclusion he's looking for? Or do these make some sense? Or is he talking about some sort of confusion in the soul? So, all right, well, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left in our scheduled time. We started about 5 or 6 minutes late. So, Darren, maybe you can have the last word.
Oh, okay. That's dangerous. I don't want the last word, but okay. This is not the last word, but I mean, we're going to have more dialogues on this. So for conversations.
For sure.
But so I had my own, I wanted actually to continue reading on from where James left off. But before I get there, I want to just respond to what Moshe was just saying about whether these distinctions, this analysis is self-serving. So, or because I think myself and others were saying it seems kind of arbitrary, and Moshe is saying that it's not arbitrary. They're actually, in a way deliberate and self-serving. And so I just want to point out that I'm not gonna, like, this is not the last word, but I just want to point out it's possible that they're both, right? That they can be arbitrary distinctions and self-serving. I think what some of us were saying when we think it's arbitrary is that, the distinctions could go any which way, or you don't have to carve up the world in the way that's being proposed, or things aren't being categorized correctly, or or there is no correct way to categorize them, or it's hard to say. So I think that's what we were saying. I think many of us were saying it's arbitrary, but that doesn't contradict that it might be, the distinctions might also be self-serving. So I think it can be both. So that's just something, maybe a line of thought to pursue. And I also think, like, self-serving, like I just want to, like for myself, like that when I hear that, I hear like selfish, but I'm not saying that's what Moshe's implication was, but like that's sort of something that someone could hear, and I tend to hear. And so maybe there's a better word for it, because I don't know if they're like, it's self-serving in a sense, it's like self-interested, or just for the purpose of his self per se. So the aim might be like, it might be serving something. For instance, in a lot of dialogues, I feel like a lot of the conversation often is about turning an individual towards philosophy, like making them curious or making them wonder about something. Like so a dialogue could serve that purpose, but it's not self-serving in a way. It's self-serving in a way, that's what Socrates wants to do, but it's not self-serving in the it's in a sense, it's serving the purpose of getting people to be interested in the world and curious. So I just want to, like, that's just maybe my own personal, like, quibble with that word. Okay, so regarding this passage that James was just reading, I just want to continue a bit because I find, like, the part a little bit later to be really interesting. So this was at 230b. So the visitor says, so they settle to get rid of the belief in one's own wisdom in another way. Theaetetus asks how. Visitor, they cross-examine someone when he thinks he's saying something, though he says nothing. Then, since his opinions will vary inconsistently, these people will easily scrutinize them. They collect his opinions together during the discussion, put them side by side, and show that they conflict with each other at the same time on the same subjects in relation to the same things and in the same respects. The people who are being examined see this, get angry at themselves, and become calmer toward others. They lose their inflated and rigid beliefs about themselves that way, and no loss is pleasanter to hear or has a more lasting effect on them. Doctors who work on the body think it can't benefit from any food that's offered to it until what's interfering with it from inside is removed. The people who cleanse the soul, my young friend, likewise think the soul, too, won't get any advantage from any learning that's offered to it until someone shames it by refuting it, removes the opinions that interfere with learning, and exhibits it cleansed, believing that it knows only those things that it does know and nothing more. Okay, so, I mean, and then the following part's interesting too, but I won't go there. So, like, to me, I guess this is sort of a new train of thought, but like what's interesting to me is that, and we see this in other dialogues too, that the part of getting, like, obtaining knowledge, which we assume that philosophy tries to do, like, there's, I just find it fascinating how, like, it's often portrayed that there's, like, shaming involved and people get angry, and people are humiliated, and how, like, but this is, and how these emotions are part of philosophy. And like, I find it interesting just because, like, I think philosophy, sometimes people have the impression that it's very, like, dispassionate, that it's purely about, like, doing, like, logic on some theological problems. But I think, like, philosophy as it exists in the world and amongst, like, human beings, at least, like, often does look the way that Socrates is presenting it, or not Socrates, this stranger is presenting it here, although Socrates does present it this way a lot. So I just find it so like, and this is a connection between like the philosopher and doing philosophy, and has some kind of connection with the soul that's interesting. So it's not, I don't know, like I feel like that might be like an understanding that might be some kind of connection with what a philosopher is, as opposed to the sophist. Because I think both use logic and analysis. Both often, use emotions and engage with emotions. I think Socrates often tries to evoke emotions in his interlocutors, often, to try to get them to turn towards the good, I think, but it's not dispassionate. You can't argue someone into, being virtuous or whatever. So I don't know, like, I just think like this section is a really interesting point. I don't know if it comes up later in dialogue. I've only read this sign reading, but I just want to point that out, that like this stuff on the emotions of knowledge are coming in here.
Thank you for that. And actually, that was a good section to read, continuing on from what I had read, because it highlights, I think, or at least to me, it highlights that the soul needs to discover things in itself, like internally. And so by this cross-examination process, the soul will discover in itself that it is being illogical. And so it can cleanse itself, I think is maybe the thrust of that particular section. So I think that was very helpful. Thank you. And we've got maybe just 2 minutes left. And so we'll go to Jose J, and Jose J maybe can have the last word.
No, like something that is well, he's talking here about the Socratic method. This is like a very, let's say, very known, popular, like a dialectic method with questions and answers and going to the truth. But it has what I see in the dialogues, he had two purposes. One purpose is to honestly get to the truth, like two interlocutors, and go and get into the truth and revising concepts. But the other purpose was that to punish like a sophist, really, to ridicule in public. And you can see, for example, the dialogue, the Euthyphro, for example, that he goes after him and discover all his exactly what he's saying in this part of the dialogue, no? All his contradictions and punishing him and punishing. At the end, he said, "Oh, I don't have time. I have to go." Anyway, and another thing that let me think, in this dialogue is considered one of in the latest period of Plato, the latest dialogues, and if you can see this way to use the Socratic method to question and to like punish interlocutors is used in the early dialogues, and after that in Plato he changed, because the dialogues, they are not like that. They are not aggressive. They are like you see in the Republic, for example, well, except book 1. Is very amicable. Is just doing the dialectic to try to find the truth. But this dialogue, that is the Sophist, that is one of the latest dialogue, he mentioned that kind of is valid to do what Socrates was doing in the maybe because after Socrates went to death, Plato, he didn't want to bother too many people. Maybe, I don't know. This is why he stopped punishing people. Okay, thank you very much, James, for the great discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you. And the interesting point about the potential changes in Plato's tone and approach to things. And certainly he's not a fan of the Sophists. I think that's fairly clear throughout a number of dialogues. Darren mentioned a number of the others as well. So, well, thank you all. I mean, it's been a great discussion as always, and looking forward to building on this discussion in our next session, which will also be on the Sophist. So I think the next session we will do we'll start where we ended today, which was 235D, and we'll go to 254B. And that's a fairly complex fairly hefty section, but I think what we discussed today, particularly in that method of continuous division, I think will be helpful in understanding that section of the Sophist. So we'll go to 254b next time in 2 weeks. And I want to thank everybody who's online today for being part of this discussion, and really looking forward to what we can learn next time, because, I've learned a lot today, just things I hadn't thought of before from points that everybody's brought up. So that's the benefit of us being in this discussion and engaging in our own dialectic process. So thanks again. I'll end the recording, and those who wish to stay online for Plato's Cafe, which is just a casual half-hour unrecorded discussion, are welcome to stay on, and we will continue to talk either about Plato or philosophy in general. So thank you all, and I'll stop the recording, and hoping to see you in 2 weeks.